The night Clara Whitmore's father shoved her across a card table to settle a debt he owed to the most dangerous man in Deadwood, she swore she would never trust another soul as long as she lived. And then Elias Caine walked through the saloon door and changed everything. It was the spring of 1877, a season that had come to Deadwood, Dakota Territory, like a reluctant guest. Cold mornings that gave way to pale, watery afternoons, the kind of light that made the gulch look almost beautiful if you didn't look too closely at the mud and the misery. The Black Hills were still raw with gold fever, still crawling with men who had abandoned their families, their dignity, and their better natures in the pursuit of something that glittered. Deadwood itself was barely 3 years old as a proper settlement, but it had aged fast and mean, the way things do when desperation is the primary industry. Clara had lived above the Gold Dust Saloon her entire life in Deadwood, or rather, for the 3 years since her father, Horace Whitmore, had dragged her west from St. Louis with promises of prosperity and a fresh start. Horace was a dreamer in the worst possible sense, a man whose dreams always seemed to require that someone else pay for them. He had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri, and Clara sometimes thought she could still see that version of him in the early mornings when he sat at the small table in their 2-room apartment above the saloon, squinting at a newspaper and drinking black coffee with an almost scholarly air. But by nightfall, Horace Whitmore became something else entirely. He became the man who sat at the poker table with whiskey-bright eyes and hands that shook, betting things he could not afford to lose. Clara was 22 years old in the spring of 1877, and she was not unaware of her own beauty, though she thought of it the way one might think of an inconvenient inheritance, something that drew the wrong kind of attention and complicated every interaction. She had her mother's dark auburn hair, which she wore in a practical braid most days, and green eyes that several men had compared to various things, emeralds, spring grass, the color of the hills after rain, as if the comparison might earn them something. She worked the floor of the Gold Dust, serving drinks and deflecting the hands and suggestions that came with the job, and she read every book she could get her hands on, and she waited for something to change. What changed was Reginald Foss. Reginald Foss had arrived in Deadwood the previous autumn with money that nobody could quite account for and an appetite for power that was immediately and obviously dangerous. He was not a large man. He was, in fact, rather slight, with narrow shoulders and a thin mustache that he attended to with obsessive care. But he had a way of occupying space that made him seem larger than he was, a stillness about him that the other men in Deadwood read correctly as the stillness of a predator. He had won the Gold Dust Saloon from its previous owner in a card game 6 months prior, a fact that gave him a peculiar kind of authority in the town. He owned the building, which meant he owned the roof over Clara and her father's heads. On the night that everything changed, the saloon was loud and warm and smelled of tobacco smoke and sawdust and the particular sweetness of spilled whiskey. The piano player, an older man named Cal who had lost 2 fingers on his right hand to frostbite on his way west, was playing something that might have been a waltz if it had been played a bit more carefully. Clara was moving between tables with a tray of drinks when she heard her father's voice rise above the general din with a quality she had learned to dread, a high, desperate note, the voice of a man who had just realized how much trouble he was in. She turned and saw Horace at the back table, the one reserved for serious games, where Reginald Foss held court most evenings. There were 4 other men at the table, and all of them were watching Horace with expressions that ranged from pity to contempt. Foss himself was watching Horace with an expression that was almost pleasant, the way a cat looks pleasant when it has a mouse precisely where it wants it. "I'm afraid, Whitmore, that I cannot continue to extend you credit," Foss was saying, in the measured, almost gentle tone he used when he was doing something terrible. "You owe me $240. That is a significant sum." I know it, Horace said, pressing his hands flat on the table as if trying to hold it down. "Give me one more hand, Foss, one more hand, and I can—" "No," Foss said simply. "The credit is done. The debt stands." Clara had set her tray down on the nearest surface and was already moving toward the table. She knew, with the cold certainty of long experience, that this was going to be bad. "What can be done about the debt, then?" Horace asked, and there was something in his voice, something she had never heard before, that made Clara's stomach drop before she had even reached the table. "Well?" Foss said, and now his pleasant expression deepened into something that made several of the other men look away. "There is one arrangement that might settle the matter entirely." He looked at Clara as she approached the table, and the look he gave her was the kind that made her feel like she needed a bath. "Your daughter works for me, does she not? Serves drinks, keeps the floor running." "She does," Horace said, and his eyes went to Clara with an expression she could not read, one she would spend years afterward trying to understand. "I've been thinking I could use someone to manage the private rooms upstairs," Foss said. "Someone presentable, someone who might also serve as a companion, for myself and for men of quality who pass through." He paused, letting the silence do the work that he preferred not to do with direct words. "In exchange for that arrangement, I would consider the debt settled. All $240. The room had gotten quiet. Cal had stopped playing the piano. Clara felt the moment crystallize around her, the way time sometimes does when something so wrong is happening that the ordinary passage of seconds seems to pause in protest. She looked at her father. Horace Whitmore looked at the table. He would not meet her eyes, he would not meet them, and in that refusal was the answer to everything. "Fine," Horace said very quietly. The word hit Clara like a physical thing. She heard it land somewhere in the center of her chest, and she felt something there that she had been protecting her whole life, some last stubborn piece of faith in her father, simply go out, the way a candle goes out when someone cups it with their hand. "I am not a debt," Clara said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her. "I am not a piece of property to be traded at a card table." Foss looked at her with what might have been amusement. "That is, I'm afraid, a rather philosophical position that does not change the practical reality of the situation. Your father owes me money. You live under my roof. I am offering a reasonable arrangement." "There is nothing reasonable about it." "Perhaps not," Foss agreed pleasantly. "Nevertheless." He gestured to two men standing near the bar, men Clara had seen before, but whose names she did not know, men who had the particular posture of people employed to do things that other people preferred not to do themselves. Clara looked at her father one more time, giving him one final chance to be the man she had believed him to be for 22 years. Horace Whitmore picked up his glass of whiskey and drank from it and said nothing. The two men moved toward her. She did not scream. She was too angry to scream. She allowed herself to be escorted to the corner of the saloon near the back stairs because she was calculating, counting men, measuring distances, thinking about the window at the top of the stairs that looked out onto the alley, wondering if she could reach it, wondering if she could reach the door before the men at the bar moved to stop her. The odds were poor, but she would find an opening. She would watch and wait and find her opening, and when she did, she would be gone from Deadwood and from Reginald Foss and from her father, before any of them had the chance to realize she was moving. The front door of the saloon opened. This was not, in itself, unusual. The front door of the Gold Dust opened and closed 100 times on any given evening, but the particular way it opened on this occasion, the particular quality of the cold spring air that entered with it, and the particular way the men at the bar shifted and stilled, made Clara look up from her calculations. The man in the doorway was very tall. That was the first thing she registered, because he had to duck slightly to clear the frame, and the frame of the Gold Dust's front door was not a low one. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that seemed almost architectural, the kind of breadth that looked like it had been built for work rather than for show. His coat was heavy canvas and worn at the elbows, and he carried a rifle in a way that suggested it was as natural an extension of himself as his own arm. His hair was dark brown and fell to his jawline, pushed back from his face with the casual inattention of a man who did not think much about such things. His jaw was square and covered in several days of dark stubble, and his eyes, when he scanned the room with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who entered unfamiliar spaces carefully, were a particular shade of gray that Clara would later describe as the color of the sky above the mountains just before a storm decided whether to break. He was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, and he moved through the saloon with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never doubted his ability to handle whatever he found when he arrived somewhere. Clara did not know this man. She had never seen him in Deadwood before, but she filed him away in the back of her mind with the instinct of someone cataloging possible variables, because the men at the bar had made room for him with a speed that told her something about how others perceived him. He sat down at the far end of the bar, set his rifle against the counter within easy reach, and ordered whiskey. Foss had not looked up. He was examining his cards with the attention of a man conducting business. "Settle her in upstairs," he said to the two men near Clara, "and then come back. I have one more hand to finish." "I would not do that." The voice came from the far end of the bar. The whole room went very still again. Foss looked up. Clara looked over. The tall man at the bar had not turned around. He was still facing the rows of bottles behind the counter, still holding his glass of whiskey, but he had spoken with a clarity and quiet that carried across the room without effort. "Beg your pardon?" Foss said. Now the man turned on his stool. He looked at Foss with those storm-gray eyes with an expression of complete calm. "I said I would not do that. Move that woman upstairs." He glanced at Clara for a moment, just a brief, assessing glance, and then back to Foss. "It does not look to me like she's going willingly." "This is a private matter," Foss said, and the pleasant tone had gained an edge. "One that does not concern you." "A woman being moved against her will in a public room concerns me," the man said simply. He picked up his glass and turned more fully on the stool, and Clara noticed the way the two men near her took an instinctive step back, as if the geometry of the room had shifted. "My name is Elias Caine. I trade in furs and I work the mountains north of here, and I have been riding for 2 days to get a drink and a hot meal, so I'm going to ask you to resolve whatever this is in a manner that does not require me to get up from this stool." The implication was clear. He would get up from the stool if required, and they would all prefer that he did not. Foss studied Elias Caine for a long moment with the precise attention of a man calculating odds. Then he smiled, and the smile was not pleasant at all. "Well, Mr. Caine, since you seem so interested in this particular matter, perhaps you would like to stake a claim on it. Sit down, play a hand." Elias Caine looked at him steadily. "What are the terms?" "Simple enough," Foss said, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who believed he was in control of the situation. "The debt in question is $240. The woman was offered in settlement of that debt. If you would like to contest that arrangement, you are welcome to do so at the table." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Winner takes all. You win, the debt is forgiven, and the woman walks free. I win, the debt stands, and she goes upstairs, and you leave Deadwood before sunrise." Elias Caine set his glass down on the bar. He looked at Clara again, and this time the look lasted longer, and she had the strange experience of feeling seen, truly seen, not assessed for value or examined for beauty, but actually looked at, the way a person looks at another person when they are trying to understand them. She lifted her chin slightly and held his gaze, and something passed between them that she could not name, something that felt like a question and an answer exchanged simultaneously. "I will need a clean deck," Elias Caine said. "Of course," Foss said and gestured to the bartender. "And I will need the woman to stand where I can see her for the duration of the game." Foss waved a hand generously. "Wherever you like." "And if I win," Elias said, pulling out the chair and settling his large frame into it with the careful economy of a man who has learned not to break things by moving carelessly, "you will provide her with written acknowledgement that the debt is cleared and that she owes you nothing, no obligation of service, no arrangement of any kind. In writing. Witnessed." Foss's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are very thorough for a fur trapper." "I am thorough for anyone," Elias Caine said, and his voice was perfectly level. Clara had moved, without fully deciding to a position just behind and to the right of Elias Caine's shoulder, where she could see the room and both players. She watched as the bartender produced a new deck, still sealed, and set it on the table. She watched Elias break the seal himself, examine the cards with quick, practiced hands, shuffle them with a fluency that told her he was not unfamiliar with card tables, and deal. The game was 5-card draw. Clara knew enough about poker to follow it, had grown up watching enough hands played in that very room to read the rhythms of a game the way other women read weather. She watched Elias's face and found it utterly unreadable, which she suspected was intentional and also the product of years of practice. Foss, for all his composure, was not quite as opaque. She had watched him play enough times to know that his left hand did something very particular when he was holding a strong hand, a slight curl of the last two fingers, almost imperceptible, but there if you were looking. The first hand went to Foss. Clara's breath tightened. The second hand went to Elias, who took it with three of a kind against Foss's two pair, and the slight shift in Foss's expression told her more than she would have liked about how seriously he was taking this now. They agreed on 5 hands, best of 3 wins. It was unusual, but it was the arrangement Foss had proposed, and Elias had accepted. The third hand was the one that seemed to last forever. Clara found herself watching the planes of Elias Caine's face in the lamplight. The strong line of his jaw, the steadiness of his hands as he held his cards, the way his eyes moved with a quiet intelligence that contradicted the rough exterior he presented to the world. She thought about the fact that he had walked into a saloon where he knew no one and had seen an injustice happening and had sat down at a card table to fix it without hesitation, without visible fear, without any apparent calculation of what it would cost him. She could not think of a single man she had known in her life who would have done that. Foss called. Elias laid down his cards, a full house, queens over 8s. Foss looked at them for a very long moment. Then he set his own cards face down on the table. A pair of 10s. The room exhaled. Foss's expression did not change dramatically, but the quality of his stillness changed in a way that Clara recognized as dangerous. He was a man accustomed to winning, and she understood instinctively that the grace with which he accepted this loss would be a temporary performance, that underneath it, something colder and more calculating was already working. "It appears, Mr. Caine, that the debt is settled," Foss said. He looked at Clara with the flat, assessing gaze of a man inventorying what he had lost, and then he nodded to the bartender. "Paper and ink." The written acknowledgment was produced, witnessed by 2 men at the bar whose signatures Clara would memorize and keep somewhere safe in her memory for a long time afterward. Elias folded the paper carefully and held it out to Clara across the table. She took it. Their fingers did not quite touch in the exchange, but she felt the proximity of his hand as something warm and solid, and she was aware that this was an absurd thing to feel in the middle of everything that was happening. She looked at the paper, then at him. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that those 2 words could not quite contain. "You are welcome," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct, and there was nothing in it that was asking for anything back. That, Clara thought, was when she first understood that this man might be dangerous to her in an entirely different way than Reginald Foss. They left the saloon together, which was partly pragmatic. She had no intention of remaining in that building any longer than necessary, and partly something she could not yet name. Outside, the deadwood night was cold and sharp and smelled of pine from the hills, and the gulch was loud with the sounds of other saloons and men moving in the dark. "Where will you go?" Elias asked. Clara considered the question honestly. She had $40 saved in a tin box under the floorboard of her room above the saloon, money she had been setting aside for the past year against exactly this kind of emergency, though she had not anticipated the specific emergency that had arrived. She had a coat and a change of clothes and the books she had accumulated over 3 years of living in a boomtown. She did not have a plan. "I need to get my things," she said, "and then I need to think." "I will come with you," he said, and when she looked at him with an expression that she hoped communicated that she did not require an escort, he added, "Foss will not come after you tonight. He is too careful for that. But he will send someone, and he will do it quietly, and I would prefer that whoever he sends finds you in company." Clara looked at him for a moment in the lamplight that spilled from the saloon window. He was standing perhaps 4 feet away from her, and at that distance she could see the details of him more clearly. The weathering on his face that came from years of outdoor living, the careful attention in his eyes, the fact that he was holding his rifle in a way that was ready without being threatening, the automatic physical vigilance of a man who had spent years in country where inattention was costly. He did not look like a man performing protectiveness for an audience. He looked like a man for whom protectiveness was simply the natural response to a situation. "All right," she said. They retrieved her things from the room above the saloon. Horace was not there. Clara packed her tin box and her 2 dresses and her 4 books and her mother's small silver hairbrush into her bag with the efficient movements of a woman who had been prepared, on some level, to leave this room for quite some time. She did not cry. She did not know yet whether she would cry later, or whether there was too much anger in her for tears, or whether the loss of the last illusion she had carried about her father had happened so completely in that single moment at the card table that there was nothing left to grieve. She paused at the door of the room and looked back at the small space with the iron bed and the worn rug and the window that looked out over the gulch. 3 years of her life, compressed into a view of mud and lamplight. She turned away and closed the door behind her. Elias had a room at Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, which was on the respectable side of Deadwood. Not that Deadwood had an enormously respectable side, but Mrs. Hennessy ran a clean house and did not allow card playing or drinking on the premises, which passed for respectability in 1877. He spoke to the woman briefly when they arrived, and Mrs. Hennessy, a wide, practical woman with an Irish accent and sharp blue eyes, looked Clara over with the kind of look that assessed everything in under 3 seconds and came to conclusions instantly. "The second room on the left is clean," she said. "Breakfast is at 7. "I cannot afford," Clara began. "I have it," Elias said quietly, and when Clara turned to refuse, he added, "It is not a debt and it is not an obligation. It is a bed for the night. You can work out the rest tomorrow." Mrs. Hennessy was already walking back toward her kitchen, and the look she gave over her shoulder held something that might have been approval. Clara lay in the clean bed in Mrs. Hennessy's second room on the left and looked at the ceiling and thought about the fact that a stranger had walked into a saloon and wagered his own money and his own safety to sit down at a card table for her, for someone he had never met, someone whose name he did not even know at the time. She turned this fact over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to look at what is underneath it, examining it from every angle, looking for the catch, looking for what it would cost her. She could not find one. This troubled her more than the alternative would have. She was accustomed to things having a cost. She slept eventually, a deep and dreamless sleep, the sleep of someone who has survived something and is not yet sure what comes next. In the morning, Elias Caine was at the breakfast table when she came downstairs. He had cleaned up since the previous night. His hair was still damp, his face still stubbled, but the stubble tidier, his hands clean. Mrs. Hennessy served oatmeal and biscuits and strong coffee, and there were 2 other boarders at the table, a mining engineer named Howell and a dry goods merchant named Peters, both of whom were politely and curious about Clara's presence in a way that told her Mrs. Hennessy had already briefed them. Clara sat down across from Elias and accepted coffee and said, "I need to ask you something." "All right," he said. "Why did you do it?" He looked at her with those gray eyes over his coffee cup. Outside, she could hear Deadwood beginning its morning. Wagons on the road, voices, the sounds of the place cranking itself awake for another day of commerce and ambition. "Because it was wrong," he said. "What was happening?" "Men see wrong things happening every day in this town," Clara said. "Most of them look the other way." "I know it," he said. There was no particular pride in his voice, no suggestion that he wanted credit for being different. He said it as if it were simply a fact about the world that he found unfortunate. "That is not an answer," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was someone who thought before he spoke, which was not a quality she had encountered frequently in Deadwood. "I was in a situation once," he said finally, "where no one did anything when something wrong was happening. I learned from it." He did not elaborate, and she did not push him. There was something in the stillness that came after those words that told her it was a significant thing, a thing with weight and history, and that she was not owed the details of it simply because he had helped her. They talked through breakfast about practical things. Clara told him that she had some money saved and intended to find work. There was a dressmaker on the main street who had mentioned needing help, and there was the possibility of work at the assay office, where the proprietor's wife had recently fallen ill and the bookkeeping had fallen behind. Elias listened without interrupting and without offering opinions she had not asked for, which she found refreshing to the point of being disorienting. "How long are you in Deadwood?" she asked. "I came to sell furs and buy supplies," he said. "I have a cabin up in the mountains, north of here, in the hills above French Creek. I was planning to stay a few days." He paused. "I may stay longer." He said this last thing in a tone that was careful and matter-of-fact, and he was looking at his coffee cup when he said it, and Clara understood with the clarity that sometimes accompanies the observation of something quiet and genuine, that this was as direct as he was likely to be about the fact that she was the reason he might stay longer, and that he was leaving the response entirely to her. She found herself experiencing an emotion she did not quite have a name for, something warm and complicated, something that wanted to be suspicious of itself and kept failing. "There's a good view of the hills from the end of the main street," she said, which was as direct as she was willing to be on her end. He looked up from his coffee cup, and the corner of his mouth did something that might, with generous interpretation, be called almost a smile. "I'll find that view," he said. The following days in Deadwood were something Clara would think about for a long time afterward, because they were the days in which she and Elias Caine became, by degrees and with considerable caution on both their parts, something approaching friends, and the process of it was unlike anything she had experienced before. She found work at the assay office, as she had hoped. The proprietor, a man named Alderman, was desperate enough for competent bookkeeping that he asked no questions about why she was no longer at the Gold Dust, and paid her a fair wage in cash at the end of each week. The work was exacting and quiet, and suited her considerably better than serving drinks. She moved her things from Mrs. Hennessy's to a small room above the dry goods store, whose owner, the merchant Peters from the boarding house, had a spare room he rented at a reasonable rate. Elias sold his furs at the trading post and spent his days with the controlled busyness of a man who knew how to be useful, helping a family 2 buildings down from Mrs. Hennessy's to repair a roof that had not survived the winter, assisting the blacksmith with a commission that required more lifting than the blacksmith could manage alone, occupying himself in the particular way of a man who was accustomed to physical labor and became restless without it. In the evenings, he would come to the dry goods store with the paper-wrapped parcel that was always one of Mrs. Hennessy's suppers, and they would sit on the step outside and eat and talk until the Deadwood night got cold enough to drive them inside. Those conversations were the things that Clara would later tell their children about, and feel something warm and aching in the telling. They talked about everything, about his life in the mountains, which he described with a spare, precise poetry that surprised her, the way he talked about the particular quality of winter light on snow, or the way sound carried differently in the mountain forests, or the habits of the elk that sometimes moved through the valley below his cabin. He talked about where he had come from, a farm in Kentucky, a father who had worked the land with a stubbornness that Clara recognized as the kind that comes from having nothing else to hold on to, a mother who had died when Elias was 12, and whom he talked about with the careful tenderness of someone who had kept something precious safe for a long time. He had come west at 19, following the possibilities that the mountains offered to a young man with strong hands and a preference for solitude, and he had found in that high country something that settled him in a way the flatlands never had. Clara told him about St. Louis, about the schoolroom where her father had taught and where she had spent hours after school reading everything she could reach, about her mother who had died of fever when Clara was 15, and left a space in the family that Horace had never been able to fill, had tried to fill with gambling and whiskey and the dreams of quick wealth that had eventually carried them both west. She told him about the years in Deadwood with a frankness that cost her something, because it required her to say aloud things she had been carrying silently, the loneliness, the exhaustion of managing her father's disasters, the particular grief of watching someone you loved become someone you did not recognize. He listened to all of it. He did not offer comfort in the form of dismissal. He did not say things like, "Well, that is all behind you now," or "You should not dwell on the past." He listened the way someone listens when they understand that being heard is itself a form of comfort, and that unsolicited advice is often just a way of ending a conversation. On the evening of the 5th day, they were sitting on the step in the last of the spring light, and Clara was telling him about a book she was reading, a novel she had found in the back of Peters's store, apparently left by a previous tenant, about a woman in England navigating the constraints of her circumstances with considerable intelligence and not enough options. And she became aware, midway through her description of the plot, that he was not looking at the middle distance, but was looking at her, with an expression that was so open and so warm and so completely unguarded that she stopped talking. "I apologize," she said. though she was not sure what she was apologizing for. "Do not," he said. "I like to hear you talk about things that interest you." Clara was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she was aware of the warmth of him beside her on the step, the way his shoulder was close to hers, the way the evening light caught the brown of his hair. She was also aware of the specific effort she was making not to think about any of these things, and of how much effort that was requiring. "Elias?" she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that same steady, patient quality she had come to recognize as fundamental to him, the quality of a man who waited rather than pressed, who understood that the things worth having arrived in their own time. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I would prefer it," he said. "I do not trust easily," she said. "I do not know how to, particularly after," she gestured vaguely in the direction of everything that had happened, "and I have decided that that is something I intend to change because it has been costing me. But it will take time." "I know it will," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she looked back out at the gulch, which was golden in the last of the evening light, and she thought that this was a strange and improbable thing, to be sitting on a step in Deadwood in the spring of 1877 and to feel something that she had largely stopped believing in, the sense that the world might, after all, contain someone worth trusting. Reginald Foss did not come after her directly. She had expected him to, had steeled herself for it, but Foss was too clever for direct action when it would be easily attributed to him. What he did instead was quieter, and in some ways worse. He began a campaign of the sort that a man with money and influence could wage in a small town. A word here, a suggestion there, a rumor that spread through the saloons and boarding houses about Clara Whitmore's character, the implication that any establishment that employed her was employing a woman of questionable morality and questionable history. Alderman at the assay office heard enough of it that he came to Clara one morning with genuine discomfort on his face and told her he had to let her go, that he was sorry, that he was a man with a business to protect. Clara thanked him politely and gathered her things and walked out into the bright, cold morning and stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed through the anger and the humiliation until they were at a manageable temperature. She told Elias about it that evening, sitting in the dry goods store at the small table Peters had made available to her for the duration of her tenancy, eating the biscuits and salt pork they had cooked on the small stove in the back. She told him without drama, factually, as if she were reporting the weather. He listened. Then he said, "There is another option." She looked at him. "Come up to the mountains," he said. "I have the cabin. There is room. The nearest settlement of any size is French Creek, which is a half-day's ride, and there's a woman there, a Mrs. Baxter, who I believe has been looking for help with the school she runs." He said all of this carefully, precisely, not looking away from her. "I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate. You would have your own space, your own room, your own privacy. I would not ask anything of you." He paused. "I'm suggesting it because Foss has reach in Deadwood, and he does not have reach in the mountains, and because I think you deserve to be somewhere where someone is not conducting a campaign against you." Clara was quiet for a very long time. The stove ticked. Outside, Deadwood made its perpetual noise. "You have thought about this," she said. "I have," he said. "For how long?" He was quiet for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, something honest. "Since the second morning," he said. She looked at the table, at the grain of the worn wood, at her own hands. She had $40 in a tin box in a room above a dry goods store, and a reputation that was being systematically dismantled by a man who could not accept being beaten at his own game. She had a father who had traded her to settle a debt and had not spoken to her since, and who she was not sure she wanted to see again for a very long time. She had a man sitting across from her who had walked into a saloon for a stranger and won her back at a card table, and had been sitting on steps with her every evening for 5 days, talking to her like she was a person of consequence. "I will consider it," she said. She considered it for one more day, and then she said yes. The ride up into the Black Hills in the early days of May 1877 was the most beautiful thing Clara had seen in 3 years of living in a land that was beautiful if you had the time and the freedom to look at it. The gulch and its noise fell away behind them, and the trail climbed through aspen and pine, the air changing with every 100 feet of elevation, growing cleaner and sharper and sweeter, and the mountains stood up around them in the pale blue morning light with the absolute indifference of things that have been here long before human troubles and will be here long after. Elias rode beside her on a dark roan gelding, carrying twice the supplies in his panniers than any reasonable person would have expected that horse to accommodate, and he pointed out things as they traveled. The tracks of a deer in the soft ground beside the trail, a hawk circling over a meadow to the east, the particular species of pine that grew above a certain elevation. He talked about the mountains with the fluency of someone reading a text they know by heart, and Clara listened and watched and felt something in her chest that had been tightly compressed for years begin, very slowly, to expand. The cabin was further up and deeper in than she had imagined. It sat in a clearing on the slope of a ridge, backed by rock and facing south toward a valley that dropped away below it in a sweep of green and gray that made her catch her breath when it came into view. It was a solid structure, built with the care of a man who intended to stay. The logs fitted closely and the roof sound, a porch along the front that caught the afternoon sun, a good stone fireplace visible through the window. There was a lean-to barn to one side where Elias kept his horses and his tools, and a kitchen garden behind the cabin where the earliest spring vegetables were already showing their first green. "It is larger than I expected," Clara said. "I built it for the long term," he said, swinging down from his horse with the easy fluency of a man for whom this motion was as natural as walking. "I was not planning to leave." He showed her the second room, which was small but well made, and had a window that looked east toward the ridgeline and the morning sky. There was a solid bed frame and a clean mattress and a chest of drawers. It was more than adequate. It was, in fact, the most private and personal space she had occupied in 3 years. "It is fine," she said, which was considerable understatement, and from the slight shift of expression on his face, she thought he might know it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Clara found, to her considerable surprise, deeply satisfying. She rode down to French Creek 3 times a week to help Mrs. Baxter with the school, which served a dozen children of various ages from the families that had settled in the valley below, and the work suited her in a way she had not anticipated. The particular pleasure of watching children understand something they had not understood before, the craft of explaining things clearly, the sense of purpose it gave her mornings. Mrs. Baxter was a widow of about 50, sharp and kind in equal measure, who asked no more questions about Clara's history than she needed to and paid her fairly for her work. At the cabin, Clara cooked and tended the garden, tasks she had learned from her mother, and which she found grounding in the same way reading was grounding. The full occupation of both hands and a portion of the mind that left the rest of the mind free to think. Elias moved through the world around the cabin with the purposeful efficiency of a man who maintained his situation with constant, unobtrusive effort, chopping and stacking wood, maintaining the trails around the property, setting and checking his traps in the valley below, repairing and building with a craftsman's attention that produced results of quiet beauty. He was the most physically capable person she had ever known, and she did not mean this only in terms of strength, though the strength was undeniable. She had watched him move stones and timber that would have required 3 ordinary men, with a focused, controlled power that was almost elegant. She meant it in the more comprehensive sense of a man who understood the physical world thoroughly and could shape it to his purposes without waste or drama. They ate together every evening and talked in the way they had talked on the steps in Deadwood, ranging widely and honestly across everything that interested them or troubled them or made them wonder. She learned more about his life in the mountains, the years of solitude that he did not describe as loneliness exactly, but as something he had been carrying and had not fully named until recently. He learned more about her years in St. Louis before the West, the schoolroom and the books and the woman her mother had been, careful and warm and possessed of a quality of attention that Clara recognized now in herself and had not, until recently, connected to its source. There was something building between them that was undeniable and that neither of them was quite ready to name. It was present in the particular awareness of each other that had become a constant, quiet fact, the way she knew where he was in the cabin without looking, the way he oriented toward her in a crowd, the way a compass orients toward north, the way their hands had begun to find reasons to be close, to brush accidentally, to linger in the passing of tools or cups or books in a way that was not quite accidental. On an evening in late May, 3 weeks after she had come to the cabin, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down over the valley. And the light was extraordinary. The particular gold of a mountain sunset that saturates everything it touches, making the ordinary world briefly magnificent. Clara was reading, and Elias was working on a piece of harness leather with his hands, and neither of them had said anything for half an hour, and the silence between them had the quality of something comfortable and rare. "I want to tell you something," he said, without looking up from the leather. "All right," she said, setting her book down. He set the leather down too, then, and he turned to look at her in the long golden light, and in his expression there was that unguardedness she had first seen on the step in Deadwood, the openness of a man who has decided to say the true thing rather than the careful thing. "I have been alone up here for 4 years," he said. "I came because I needed the quiet, and I stayed because it seemed like enough. I thought it was enough." He paused, looking at her with steady gray eyes. "It is not enough anymore." Clara held very still. "I am not asking for anything," he continued, in that careful, precise way he had when he was saying something that mattered. "I am telling you something that is true, and I am leaving what you do with it entirely up to you. But I thought you deserved the truth, because you told me that trust costs you something, and I want to be someone who earns the trust instead of just asking for it." The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the valley below was filling up with shadow while the sky above it was still bright, and Clara looked at this man who had walked into a saloon for a stranger and built a cabin to last and talked to her every evening on a step and in front of a fire with complete honesty for 6 weeks, and she felt the last of the careful architecture she had built around herself, all the reasonable caution, all the practiced self-protection, simply yield, the way ice yields in spring, not dramatically, but all at once. "Elias," she said. "Yes." She reached across the space between them and took his hand, which was warm and rough and very large, and she held it and looked at him and said, "I'm not asking for anything either. I'm telling you something that is true." His hand closed around hers with a gentleness that was enormous, coming from the strength of him, the particular care of something powerful moving slowly. He looked at her with an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life as the definition of the word adoration. Not the shallow performative adoration of men who wanted something, but the deep, steady kind that had been accruing quietly for weeks and had finally found its way to the surface. He leaned forward and kissed her, slowly, the way he did everything, with care and intention and the patience of a man who understood that the best things were not hurried. She kissed him back, and the golden light of the mountain evening wrapped around them on the porch, and below them the valley folded into its evening shadow, and somewhere in the pines a bird made its last call of the day. They sat on the porch for a long time after that, her hand in his, watching the stars come out over the mountains. They talked, as they always did, about everything and nothing, about the way the mountains looked at night, about the particular silence of high country after dark, about the future, in terms that were still careful but no longer evasive, the future as a thing they were beginning, by degrees, to imagine together. Reginald Foss did not disappear from their lives as cleanly as Clara had hoped. She had understood intellectually that a man like Foss did not simply accept a loss and move on, but the distance of the mountains had made it possible to almost believe it, to almost convince herself that the whole terrible episode in the Gold Dust Saloon had been resolved by the hand of cards and the piece of paper in her bag, and the 60 miles of mountain terrain between her and Deadwood. The reminder came in the form of a rider who appeared at the base of the trail to the cabin on a Saturday morning in early June, a man Clara did not recognize, but Elias clearly did. The way he straightened and watched the approach, his hand moving toward his rifle with the unhurried preparedness she had come to recognize. The rider was a young man named Coleman, who worked occasionally for Foss as a messenger. He carried a letter addressed to Clara, which Elias took from him with a politeness that contained a very clear message about the preferred direction of departure, and Coleman took the message and rode back down the trail without dismounting. The letter was from Foss. It was short and elegant and deeply unpleasant. It stated that he had reconsidered the circumstances of the card game in light of information suggesting that the deck had been manipulated, and that he was prepared to bring this accusation before the territorial court unless Miss Whitmore returned to Deadwood and honored the original arrangement. It was blackmail, articulated with the careful indirection of a man who knew exactly how much he could say without making himself legally vulnerable. Clara read it twice and then looked at Elias. He had read it over her shoulder. "He is lying," she said, "about the cards." "Yes," Elias said, "though that does not make the threat less real. A territorial court in 1877 is not always interested in the difference." Clara folded the letter carefully. The fear was there. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it, but underneath the fear was something harder and steadier, something that had been growing in her for weeks in the mountain air. She was not the woman she had been in the Gold Dust Saloon, she realized. She was not the woman who had stood at that card table watching her father sell her without finding a way to fight. "We need to go to Deadwood," she said. Elias looked at her. "Not to comply," she said quickly. "To fight it. If he is going to make accusations, I would rather face them in front of people than run from them up here and spend the rest of my life waiting for the next letter. And I have the paper he signed, the signed acknowledgement. That document is legal. If he challenges the validity of the card game, he challenges the validity of his own signature on a witness document." Elias studied her for a moment with the expression he wore when he was genuinely impressed by something, an expression she had learned to recognize in recent weeks. "You have thought about this," he said, in the same tone she had used to him about the cabin. "I have," she said, in the same tone he had used back. They rode to Deadwood 2 days later, after Elias sent word ahead to a man he knew there, a lawyer by the name of Greer, who had come to the territory from Philadelphia and whose practice had grown with the boom, and who was, by all accounts, capable of navigating the complicated legal terrain of a mining town with both intelligence and integrity. Greer met them at Mrs. Hennessy's, because that was the only establishment in Deadwood that Elias trusted to be reliably outside Foss's sphere of influence. Greer was a thin, precise man of 40, with spectacles and an impressive ability to sit very still while listening. And he read Foss's letter and the signed acknowledgement with the careful attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of clear-cut case. "This document is fully valid," he said, tapping the acknowledgement, "signed and witnessed. His signature on this paper acknowledging the cleared debt is as binding in territorial court as anything he might subsequently claim about the card game. The accusation of card manipulation would require evidence, which he does not have, because there was none. In my opinion, he is gambling that the threat alone will be enough." "He has been wrong about one gamble already," Clara said. Greer looked at her over his spectacles with something that might have been amusement. "Indeed. I would suggest the following course of action." He laid out a plan that was precise and efficient, a formal response to Foss through legal channels, referencing the document, making clear that any challenge to its validity would be met with a counterfiling that examined the original circumstances under which the debt was incurred and the arrangement proposed, which in the opinion of any fair-minded judge constituted something significantly more legally questionable than a card game. In plain terms, if Foss pushed, they would make the circumstances of how he had attempted to use a young woman as debt payment a matter of public legal record. It was the kind of pressure that a man like Foss, who operated in the spaces between legality and illegality and depended on not having light shone too directly on his methods, would understand immediately and completely. Elias had one meeting with Foss in person, which Clara had not planned for and found out about afterward. When Elias came back to Mrs. Hennessy's in the early afternoon with a small cut above his left cheekbone and a completely untroubled expression. He sat down at the table and accepted the coffee Mrs. Hennessy produced with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen trouble come through her door before and knew the appropriate response was hot coffee. "What happened?" Clara asked. "I explained our position," Elias said. "With your face?" "The cut is from a door frame," he said, and she could not tell with certainty whether this was true. Foss was more interested in the legal position once I had made it clear that we were not going away. "And?" "He will not pursue it," Elias said. "He has decided that the cost is greater than the benefit." How do you know? He looked at her steadily. Because I know men like Foss. They are brave with the weak and careful with the strong. He has made a calculation, and the calculation has come out in our favor. Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the cut above his cheekbone, at the steadiness of his hands around the coffee cup, at the expression on his face that was calm and certain and entirely trustworthy. She reached across the table and touched the cut gently with her fingertips, and he went very still, and she left her hand against the side of his face for a moment, just feeling the warmth of him. "Thank you," she said. "You did most of it," he said. "Greer, the document, the counterfiling, that was yours." "We did it," she said. He turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, just briefly, with the quiet expressiveness of a man who did not make large gestures, but made small ones that counted. They stayed in Deadwood for 2 more days, taking care of the remaining legal formalities with Greer, and on the second day, Clara went to the Gold Dust Saloon. Not because she wanted to see Foss, she did not, and not because she wanted to revisit the scene of the worst night of her life. She went because she had been told that morning by Mrs. Hennessy that Horace Whitmore had been asking after her. She found her father in his usual corner, which was somehow the saddest thing, that he was still there, still in the same corner, still with the same glass, 3 years older, and wearing it visibly. He had aged in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with choices. He looked up when she came in, and his face did something complicated, relief and shame in a combination that she thought probably summed up the man he was. She sat down across from him. She did not intend to stay long. "Clara," he said, "I'm glad you are. I heard you were doing well, up in the mountains." "I'm doing well," she said. "I wanted to say—" He stopped, started again. "What I did was wrong. I know it was wrong. I knew it when I did it, and I have thought about it every day since." Clara looked at her father, at the man who had taught her to read, who had read her stories at night in the St. Louis schoolroom, who had danced with her mother in the kitchen on her birthday every year, who had become, slowly and then all at once, someone who could do what he had done. She thought about everything she had wanted to say to him for months, all the careful arguments and the measured anger and the carefully constructed speeches she had assembled in the back of her mind. What she said was, "I know." "I am sorry," Horace said. "I know that too," she said. She did not tell him that she forgave him because she was not sure that she did, not yet, not fully. But she did tell him that she was all right, and that she was somewhere safe, and that she hoped he would find his way to making better choices. She said this without bitterness, which surprised her. There had been so much bitterness in her for so long that its absence felt strange, like a weight she had put down somewhere without noticing. She stood up to leave, and Horace looked at her with the face of a man who understood that he was looking at the consequence of what he was, and who had no one to blame for it but himself. "That man who came for you," he said. "Caine. Is he good to you?" "He is the best man I have ever known," Clara said, simply and completely. Horace nodded, and in the nod was something that might have been the closest thing to a blessing he was capable of giving. She left him there with his glass in his corner and his diminished world, and she walked out into the Deadwood afternoon and found Elias waiting for her outside, which she had not asked him to do, but which she might have predicted if she had been paying attention. He looked at her face when she came out, reading it with the quiet attentiveness he brought to everything. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. She thought for a moment. "Better than all right." He offered her his arm, which was not something he did usually, a gesture with a formality that suited the moment, and she took it, and they walked back through Deadwood toward Mrs. Hennessy's and the horses and the road home. The word came to her with such naturalness that it stopped her for a step. Home. The cabin on the ridge above the valley, with the porch and the kitchen garden and the evening light. She had not had a home that was genuinely hers since St. Louis, since her mother. She had the sudden clear sense that she was about to have one again. Summer came to the Black Hills with a generosity that made the previous spring seem like a tentative draft. The meadows below the cabin went green and then gold, and the wildflowers came in successive waves through June and July, and the valley below was alive with the birds that nested in the valley grasses and the elk that moved through the lower timber in the evenings. Clara taught in French Creek through the week and tended the garden on the weekends and read in the long summer evenings on the porch. And Elias was always there, working near enough to be present, far enough to give her the space she had told him she needed, finding the exact balance with the precision of a man who paid close attention. Their courtship, if that was the right word for the slow and mutual unfolding of two people who had both been alone too long and were both too honest to be careless about it, had the quality of something grown from the ground up, not built quickly, but establishing deep roots in the months they spent talking on that porch, learning each other's thinking and each other's silences, discovering the particular ways in which two separate lives might, with care and intention, become something more than the sum of their parts. He kissed her often now, and she kissed him back, and the warmth of it in those long summer evenings was something she had stopped trying to reason herself out of, had stopped examining for catches, had simply let be what it was, which was, she had concluded with the clarity that sometimes comes when you stop fighting a true thing, the best thing in her life. On an evening in late July, they were sitting in the meadow below the cabin in the long evening light, and Elias was not talking, which was not unusual for him, but the quality of his silence was different. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking out over the valley with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was working up to saying something important. She waited. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He turned to look at her, and his expression was open in that particular way. The vulnerability of someone who is saying the true thing when the true thing is the most important thing they have ever said. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because it makes sense, or because it is the practical thing, or because it solves any particular problem. Because you are the person I want to be with for the rest of my life, and because every day since you came here, I have been more certain of that. And because I think you deserve to have someone ask you properly, in full daylight, with no cards on the table." The last phrase made her smile. She could not help it, and the smile softened into something deeper and more permanent when she looked at him and saw the steadiness in his gray eyes, the earnestness of a man who meant every single word he was saying. "Yeah?" "Yes," she said, and she said it with the same simplicity and directness with which he had asked, because it was the only true answer and she had known it for some time. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the blue-green of mountain water, which he told her later he had ridden to French Creek specifically to have made by the jeweler there, a Mexican craftsman named Santos who worked with the turquoise that came from the hills, and who had understood exactly what was needed without being told in detail. He slid it onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, because of course he had paid attention to such things. She looked at it on her hand in the summer light, and then she looked at him, and she thought that the whole long, improbable path from St. Louis to Deadwood to this meadow in the Black Hills had been heading here all along, and she was glad, profoundly, completely glad, for all of it, even the hard parts, because the hard parts had led her here, to this man and this life in this particular evening light. They were married in French Creek in August, in the small church that served the valley community, in a ceremony conducted by the Methodist minister who traveled the Territory circuit and happened to be in the valley that week. Mrs. Baxter organized what she called a modest gathering, which turned out to involve most of the families in the valley and a considerable amount of food, and Mrs. Baxter's own fiddle playing, which was enthusiastic if not always strictly accurate in pitch. Clara wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that Elias had told her made her eyes look like the hills in summer, a statement she had teased him about for a week. He wore his best shirt and a jacket that Mrs. Hennessy had sent from Deadwood, along with a note that said simply, "About time," and a jar of her blackberry preserves. The ceremony was short, and the vows were the traditional ones, but Clara said them with a completeness that surprised her. She had not expected to feel the weight of the words so strongly, but when she looked at Elias standing across from her in that small church with the mountain light coming through the plain windows, and his gray eyes steady and warm and entirely present, the words felt like the most honest thing she had ever said. Mrs. Baxter played the fiddle enthusiastically at the gathering afterward, and the children from the school had made a garland of mountain wildflowers that they presented to Clara with the grave ceremony of children who have been told this is an important occasion and are taking their responsibility seriously. Elias danced with Clara in the meadow outside the church, and he was, to her delight, a considerably better dancer than his appearance suggested. He had learned, he told her, from his mother, who had believed that a man who could not dance was missing something fundamental about being a person. They rode back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the valley gold around them, the mountains blue and enormous above, the way home as familiar now as the lines of his face. The years that followed were the life that Clara had stopped believing was possible, and then discovered was not only possible but actual, present, here, the life she was living. The cabin on the ridge above the valley, which Elias expanded in the second year by adding a second room on the east side, which he built over the course of a winter with the careful craftsmanship he brought to everything. The kitchen garden, which grew larger every spring, and which she managed with the systematic pleasure of someone who liked to see things she had tended come to something good. The school in French Creek, where she taught through the week and which grew from 12 students to 20 as more families settled in the valley, until Mrs. Baxter suggested they apply for a proper territorial school charter, which they did and received. Elias continued trapping through the winters and expanded his trade in the spring of 1879 by partnering with a man from French Creek named Torres in a small logging operation that supplied timber to the growing settlements in the valley and beyond. It was careful, sustained work, the kind that built something over time rather than the quick-strike economics of the gold rush that had built and was already beginning to unmake Deadwood. Elias had no interest in quick strikes. He was interested in things that lasted. Their first child was born in the spring of 1879, a boy they named Samuel, after Elias's father. He arrived in the early morning with a force of personality that manifested immediately as a pair of lungs that Mrs. Baxter, who attended the birth with brisk efficiency, described as impressive. Clara held him in the pale morning light with the particular dazedness of someone who has just been shown something entirely new about the nature of love, and Elias sat on the edge of the bed with one enormous hand curved around Samuel's head, with the absolute care of a man holding something infinitely precious, and the look on his face was one that Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life as the most complete image she had of him. Samuel grew up in the mountains with his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity, a combination that made him simultaneously the most adventurous and the most thoughtful child in the valley, qualities that occasionally exhausted his parents and more frequently filled them with an admiration they tried not to express too obviously. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose after Clara's mother, came in the winter of 1881. She arrived in the middle of a snowstorm while Elias was outside feeding the horses, and Mrs. Baxter was calm and competent, and Rose herself seemed entirely untroubled by the circumstances of her arrival. When Elias came in from the barn and found Clara sitting up in bed with a second child, he stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long moment with snow on his shoulders and an expression of such complete astonishment and joy that Clara started laughing despite herself, which made Rose, who was 6 hours old, open her eyes and look around with the vague displeasure of someone who had not been consulted about the noise level. The years built on each other with the satisfying accumulation of a life well lived. The cabin became a house, properly, over time, with the east room and then a proper kitchen addition that Clara had been planning in her head for 3 years, and that Elias built in the summer of 1883 with Samuel's enthusiastic, if not always structurally helpful assistance. The valley below the ridge grew from a scattering of homesteads to a proper community, and French Creek grew with it, acquiring a proper general store and a post office and eventually a telegraph office, which connected them to the world in a way that Clara found occasionally startling and mostly useful. Deadwood, 60 miles to the east, continued its trajectory from boomtown to something more permanent, though it remained a rough-edged place. Reginald Foss, she heard through occasional letters from Mrs. Hennessy and from the French Creek merchant who traveled to Deadwood for supplies, had eventually overextended himself in a scheme involving a mining claim and some investors from Chicago, and had lost the Gold Dust Saloon in 1880. He had left Deadwood shortly thereafter, and no one she knew had heard much from him since. The information arrived without particular triumph. She had been far enough away from him for long enough that he had become a relatively small figure in her rear view, the man who had tried to reduce her to a line item in someone else's ledger, and had found, to his surprise, that she was considerably more than that. Horace Whitmore came to visit in the summer of 1880, having written ahead with the appropriate uncertainty of a man who was not sure of his welcome and was prepared to accept whatever he was given. Clara had thought about this for a long time before she wrote back. She had spoken to Elias about it, who had listened with his characteristic patience, and then said, "He is your father. What do you want?" What she wanted, she had discovered on reflection, was not what she would have predicted. She did not want retribution, had no taste for it, found it as uninteresting as she had always found cruelty. What she wanted was what she had: her life, her husband, her children, her students, this ridge and this valley and this work. Horace's visit was, in the context of all of that, a manageable thing. He arrived on a Tuesday, thinner than she remembered, and wearing the expression of a man who had spent 3 years practicing what to say and still wasn't sure. He met Elias with the wariness of a man who understood that the person standing in front of him had every reason to be hostile and was choosing, with visible deliberateness, not to be. He met Samuel, who was 14 months old and entirely unconcerned with the complexities of adult relationships, and who climbed on Horace with the amiable indifference of very young children to strangers. "He is a fine boy," Horace said, and his voice had something in it that Clara recognized as genuine. "He is," she said. "He's going to be trouble, but the good kind." Horace smiled, and in the smile she caught a glimpse of the man from the street. Louis' schoolroom, the man who had read her stories and danced with her mother in the kitchen. She could not give him full forgiveness in a single afternoon. Forgiveness, she had learned, was less an event than a process, something you chose repeatedly over time. But she could give him the afternoon. She could give him supper in the company of his grandson, and the knowledge that his daughter was, against considerable odds, all right. More than all right. He did not stay long, 2 days, and then he rode back toward the east, smaller and somehow more peaceful than he had arrived. He would write occasionally in the years after, short, careful letters that she answered briefly and honestly, and the correspondence built its own small architecture of reconciliation, modest and incomplete and real. The summer of 1885 was a dry one, the kind that worried the farmers in the valley and made the creeks run low. But at the elevation of the cabin, the springs held and the garden survived, and the elk came down from the upper ridges earlier than usual, moving through the timber below the house in the blue dusk, with the stately unconcern of creatures that have been navigating these hills long before anyone decided to build a cabin on the ridge. Clara was standing on the porch watching them one evening, a cup of tea in her hands, Samuel running in the meadow with the neighbor's dog, and Rose sitting on the porch step drawing something elaborate in the dirt with a stick. Elias came out of the house and stood behind her, settling his hands on her shoulders with the easy familiarity of 8 years, and she leaned back against him and felt the solid warmth of him, the unchanging fact of his presence, which had become as much a part of her world as the ridge and the valley and the morning light. "There are 7 of them tonight," she said, watching the elk. "8, he said. "There is a calf behind the big cow, hard to see." She looked and found it, small and spotted, moving close to its mother's side. She felt the familiar pleasure of this, of noticing things together, of having someone whose attention moved in the same direction as hers. "I need to write to Mrs. Baxter tomorrow about the school application," she said. "If we submit it before September, we have a better chance of the fall funding." "I know," he said. "And Torres wants to discuss the Eastern contract." "I know that too," he said. "We can ride down on Thursday." They were quiet for a moment, the evening settling around them, the elk moving slowly through the lower timber, Samuel calling out triumphantly about something the dog had done. Rose looked up from her drawing to watch her brother with the long-suffering tolerance of a 4-year-old who had decided that older brothers were inherently theatrical. Are you happy?" Elias asked, and his voice was quiet and direct, the way it always was when he said the thing he actually meant. Clara turned to look at him over her shoulder, and in the fading evening light she could see all of him, The strong face, the gray eyes that were warm now in a way she had come to understand, was specifically reserved for her. The jaw that was still stubbled and always would be. The hair that had grown a bit longer this summer and was pushed back from his face in that characteristically inattentive way. He was 36 years old, and the years of mountain living had carved him to his essential self, and she found him more beautiful than she had words for. "I am," she said, and she meant it in its fullest possible sense, not the simple contentment of a comfortable life, but the deep bones and marrow satisfaction of a person who has found exactly where they belong and who they belong with. "Are you?" He pressed his lips to her temple, slowly, with the same care he brought to everything. "Every single day," he said. Samuel came running across the meadow with the neighbor's dog at his heels, already talking before he had fully arrived, something about a rabbit and the dog and a sequence of events that seemed to involve a good deal of running. Rose stood up from her drawing on the porch step and announced with 6-year-old authority that she had drawn a horse, and it was very good, and held it up for their inspection. It was, in fact, quite recognizably a horse. "That is excellent," Elias told her, with the gravity that Rose's work always received from him, and Rose nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had been told what they already knew. Clara looked at her children and her husband in the evening light of the mountains and thought, not for the first time, about the night in Deadwood that had led her here, the card table in her father's silence, and the two men moving toward her, and the door of the Gold Dust Saloon opening, and a man ducking under the frame with a rifle and a quality of absolute stillness. She thought about the full house, queens over eights, laid down on a green baize table in the back of a saloon, while the piano player sat with his hands still, and the whole room held its breath. She thought about the step at Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house and the dry goods store, and the ride up through the aspens into the mountains, the cabin coming into view on the ridge with the valley sweeping away below it. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, not as a commodity, not as a settlement of accounts, but chosen the way Elias had chosen her, completely and clearly, with eyes open, sitting down at a table in a strange saloon, and staking his own money and his own safety on the simple proposition that what was happening was wrong, and he was going to do something about it. She had once believed that love was a thing that required you to make yourself smaller, to reduce yourself to something that someone else could own. She understood now that she had confused love with what her father had accepted instead of it, the quick trades, the easy bargains, the reduction of one person's life to a line in someone else's ledger. What she had found instead was something entirely different, the kind of love that made her larger, that had room for her mind and her stubbornness and her books and her students and her opinions and her grief and her joy, the kind of love that asked nothing of her except that she be exactly what she was. She had been sold to settle a debt in a saloon in Deadwood in the spring of 1877 by a man who had once loved her and had chosen, in a terrible moment, something easier than love. And then a mountain man had sat down at that table and won her back with a hand of cards and a refusal to look the other way, and had then spent the next 8 years proving, every single day with every small and true and careful thing he did, that winning her back at that card table had been the easiest part of what he intended to give her. The elk moved through the lower timber, and the mountains held the last of the light, and her children ran in the meadow, and her husband's hands were warm on her shoulders, and the world was, in this moment and in every moment that had led to it, exactly as good as she had once, against considerable evidence, dared to hope it could be. Samuel found the rabbit he had been chasing, which leaped away into the high grass with an impressive burst of speed, and declared this the greatest day of his life. Rose finished her drawing of the horse and began a drawing of a mountain, which she announced would also be very good. Elias suggested supper, and they went inside, all of them, into the warm light of the cabin on the ridge, and closed the door against the mountain dark. It was the spring of 1885, 8 years from the night that everything had changed, and Clara Caine, she had taken his name without being asked, had decided on it herself, and told him one morning over breakfast, with a matter-of-factness that had made him smile with his whole face in that rare way, was 30 years old and more herself than she had ever been, and the man across the table from her was the reason for most of it, and she told him so regularly and without embarrassment, because she had learned finally and completely that love that is true does not diminish in the saying of it. They ate supper together at the table that Elias had built the first winter, which had been added to and repaired and polished by years of use until it had the quality of something that would outlast all of them, solid and warm and bearing the marks of the life that had been lived around it. The lamp made a warm circle, and Samuel talked and Rose ate with the focused efficiency of a small person with somewhere to be. And outside the mountain, dark held the stars with the careless magnificence of something that has no interest in being noticed, but is beautiful anyway. This was the life. This, exactly, was the life. The fire and the table and the faces she loved and the knowledge settled so deep in her now that she could not remember what it had felt like not to have it, that she was safe and seen and wanted not for what she could be traded for, but for the irreducible, complete, particular truth of who she was. She caught Elias looking at her across the table with that expression, the one she had first seen on the step at Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, the unguarded warmth of a man who was not performing anything, who was simply showing her what was there. She smiled at him, and he smiled back, the slow, full smile that he gave rarely enough that it was always a gift. Samuel asked if there would be more biscuits. There were more biscuits. Outside, the black hills held the spring dark, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, indifferent patterns, and the cabin on the ridge was warm and bright against the mountain night, and inside it, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way were building, day by careful day, the most durable and essential thing that can be built between two human beings, a life that was genuinely, wholly, irrevocably shared.